Writing is hard work. I am assuming that I am not telling you anything new here. I write first thing in the morning because my first energy is my best energy, and writing requires that. I know that some of you get a burst of energy in the evening, and that's your best energy, and that's great. You don't have to at me. Because writing is so difficult, I am firmly in the camp that we need to make it as enjoyable as possible, to require the use of as little willpower as possible, which psychologists have been studying and found is definitely a finite resource. One that you can grow, but one that you don't want to disproportionately tap on an endeavor as long as writing a novel or a bunch of novels. The good news is I enjoy writing, and so it doesn't take a huge amount of willpower. But there is some pretty common advice you see out there that would have me not enjoying writing and probably giving up. Okay, so I've said it before. This is my, this is my humble brag. My novel, The Horde, reached number 2 in horror on the Amazon Kindle charts. That was my highest charting book ever. Stephen King had unfortunately opened the pre-order for one of his tomes, and I couldn't hope to surpass him. We have a very bitter rivalry to this day, to the point where he will pretend that he doesn't even know who I am. And so the best I've ever done is coming in runner-up in a loudest whisperer contest. That joke of loudest whisperer contest is one that I stole about winning a speed walking race. And it applies really well to horror as one of the worst selling genres. Like, selling the best in horror will barely have you cracking the top 100 of the best-selling books overall, unless you're one of the couple of big names. So why do I write horror when it sells so poorly, excepting for those few big names, one in particular, whom I will not be mentioning again? Well, when I was a kid, I was a voracious reader. I'm sure that almost everyone watching this was. We had this amazing old library. It was like hewn stone and hardwood, and it smelled exactly like you think that a library should. And when you went through the front door, you either went upstairs to the adult floor or you went downstairs to the kid book floor. But around the time that I turned 10, we got a new modern library where everything was on one level. It was far more accessible, so that was good. And it also just had like a big central aisle that divided the children's section from the grown-up books section. That is a lot less intimidating of a thing to cross, and so when I was 10 years old, one day I wandered across and I found It by Stephen King, who I just said that I wasn't going to mention again. And I literally have been obsessed ever since. I was a super fraidy cat as a kid, and reading those books left indelible scars on my psyche, I guess. I've read very, very widely. I certainly don't limit myself to reading horror by any stretch. At this point, I probably read less horror than I read some other things. But it's always been a part of my life. And then when I was a teenager, I started having night terrors. There are two kinds. There's a kind that is caused by like trauma, and it's basically you having a panic attack in your sleep. And there's the kind where you have a genetic disorder where your body does not stay paralyzed during nightmares, and you get up and you hallucinate. You see your nightmare out there in the real world, and you just cause chaos because of that. That's the kind that I have. I don't know why they're called the same thing. They don't seem similar in the slightest, but I became really obsessed with what I call epistemic horror not long after that. Ontology is the philosophy of what is. Epistemology is the philosophy of how we know what is. Think Descartes' demon. Think a supercomputer that is feeding your brain in a vat stimulation. Think Jacob's Ladder, which was my favorite horror movie for a very long time. And in basically all of my early works, you will find people who are struggling with not being able to trust their own senses. It's not my constant topic anymore, but it was for years. And so my nature is to write horror. But there is definitely advice to, if you are wanting to be a successful writer, that you look at the market and you determine where the gaps are and what is popular, and then you decide what you are going to write from this business-minded mentality. And so people can ask me, like, wouldn't you, and have asked me, wouldn't you make more money if you wrote in basically any other genre? And I can say, yes, if I wrote it well. Writing is really, really difficult already. For me, it is then going to become exponentially more difficult to write something that I am not interested in. And honestly, like, you need to be performing at peak in order to cut through all of the noise of all of the books that are being published on a daily, hourly, minutely basis these days. Can you write in this popular genre as well as somebody who loves and lives this genre? And even more, can you do it for long enough to gain traction? I said it in other videos that you have to be prepared to write and write and write until something catches hold. Can you do that in this other genre that you are writing for the sake of popularity? There's always this argument that comes up because, like, when this idea is proposed in something of any length, they automatically always get ahead of that argument by saying, well, think about the pulp writers. The pulp writers just sat down and treated it like a job and cranked out word after word and got paid. And honestly, I do think that that is a fair point to make. I just don't think that it satisfies in this day and age. So let's talk about the pulp authors who wrote in genres that they looked down on, that they didn't respect. I think that they did one of two things. Either they elevated their work, they wrote what the general populace would enjoy, but they lifted it up. For me, and this is a topic for another day, literary has nothing to do with genre. And what they did is they wrote the literary version of whatever their genre was. They may have focused on language. They might have focused on language and psychology. They might have focused on greater explorations of what it is to be human. You just have to look at Raymond Chandler's detective novels to see why they are still read today when so many of those hard-boiled detective novels are completely forgotten. Look at J.G. Ballard's early science fiction work, his post-apocalyptic work. It's just as good as the stuff that he started becoming an acclaimed literary author for later on. Look at Graham Greene. He, from my understanding, really looked down on the thrillers that he wrote to pay the bills. But read his novel, The Heart of the Matter, and tell me that it's not at its core a thriller, while at the same time being one of the 100 greatest novels of all time. Thrillers clearly live inside of him, whether he wanted to acknowledge it or not. Or, number two, they wrote crap. And it sold because at that time, people were reading as their primary means of entertainment, and there weren't that many people who could write. Now, I'm not saying don't compromise. If you have both horror and paranormal romance in your soul, for the love of God, write the paranormal romance. You know, you still get to write about all the same monsters, just make them sexy and everybody doesn't die at the end. And I'm sure that you'll see much more success. I would never encourage anybody to write horror if they have something else that engages them even a fraction as much. But if Westerns are what is truly in your soul, the only major genre that I can call out as being worse selling than horror, write Westerns. I know that you're thinking, wow, that sounds like really terrible Pollyanna advice. And I can see why. But to be blunt, you probably won't make it if you don't write what you enjoy. This isn't a purity test. I'm not saying this because I would rather have you be a starving artist than a well-fed hack. Writing is a war of attrition. Puppies move a lot. 85% of people want to write a novel. Something like half of them start a novel. Something like 1% of those people finish their novel, and 1% of the people who finish that novel go on to get it published or have a significant writing career after self-publishing and not gaining traction. This is what I call the author funnel. I made 2 videos about the different steps in it and how to overcome them. But the numbers I used in that video, I think, came from the assumption that you were writing something that you enjoyed writing and passionately, and a story that you passionately wanted to get out. So you want to toss writing something that you aren't interested in on top of all of that? You just added the deadliest, most blade-filled section of the meat grinder to chew yourself up in. And then, of course, there's the question of, if you finish it, is it going to be good? Is it going to be as good as the novel that you wanted to write, which would barely have a chance of attracting any attention? I don't think that struggling to write something makes it bad. I have had plenty of times where I have struggled to write something and I go back and read it and it reads just as well as something that just like flowed from my fingertips. But struggling to achieve something that you love is very different from struggling to keep your gorge down as you produce something that you despise. Then there's the question, do you know the genre really well? Do you know how to perfectly play with all of the parts that will allow you to both satisfy and surprise a reader who you should assume is steeped in this genre, just consuming it nonstop? We no longer live in a time where people are ravenous for every half-baked thing a writer cranks out. Certainly, I am not suggesting that fiction is a meritocracy where cream automatically rises to the top. Both cream and crap can float. But in my soul, when it comes to readers who I think are a generally intelligent lot, I feel that inauthenticity is easier for them to sense than like all of the little nitty-gritty details that we as writers care about. They might not see your slips in a narrator perspective, but I imagine that many can sense when they are being talked down to. And when it comes to writers who really are going to be able to analyze this stuff, you're definitely going to have a much easier time getting the approval and promotion of your fellow authors if you have written cream versus crap. But for the sake of argument, let's say that you are that person who gets famous from their first or second novel and that you fool everyone, you made it. You had a hit for writing a novel in a genre you don't like. Why do you want this? A small part of my last video was about finding your whys in order to be able to intelligently set your long-term goals. Say that I want to be a successful businessman. Why? Because I want to make good money. Why? Because I want to be able to retire early and enjoy spending time with my family and on my hobbies and interests. Why? Well, that is the why. So that is this person's why. That's the end of that, because there's no reason beyond that. That is what they want. Now, once you've figured that out, you can judge if being a successful businessman is the best path towards that final why. You are delaying it by not having the time now if you're working 70-hour weeks, but maybe it's worth it to have a lot of freedom in the end. Or you might decide that there's a better path. For what writing takes, I think that writing has to actually be the why. If you want to be a financially successful writer, that's fine. I'm not living in la la land where I think that you don't have to make any money. But I think that if you want to be a financially successful writer, the why still has to be writing. Being a financially successful author lets you do your writing and your creating during your work time, and then you are able to justify doing a lot of it, spending as much time as it needs, and then still spending time with your family and pursuing your interests and all that in your free time. I think that's kind of that's the dream of people, realistic people whose goal is to be a financially successful author. If you are writing something you don't want to write, which means you're not satisfying the why of writing, I have to think that you've gotten your priorities twisted. Because that must mean that you're writing for money or accolades. And there are much, much better paths towards both of those things. Writing is one of the lowest percentage ways to achieve basically any why that motivates you other than the why of writing itself. And even once you achieve financial success as an author, it's that loudest whisperer contest again. Unless you're a mega bestseller, it has one of the worst returns on effort. Like, if you're not going to love the writing that you do, focus on your day job. But your day job has a boss telling you what to do, and you don't like being told what to do. None of us are. I've established that I hate being told what to do. So if you become successful writing something that you don't like, do you really not have a boss? Or have you traded one boss for 10,000 fickle bosses? If you write, let me put it this way, if you write exactly what you want to read, then you'll know that you have made exactly what at least one reader wants to read. And you'll know that there are probably more readers like that reader. If you write for yourself, you automatically write for others. I am not in the camp that says that, especially early on in the process, that you need to be thinking of your ideal reader except for yourself as your ideal reader. Because if you write what requires external validation, because it's not really what you care about, because you're writing for a theoretical person that you're trying to imagine what they like, then you are required to let all of those little voices pour in, making their little demands and their little judgments. That means that you will answer to people who think they know what they like, but really don't know what they want out of a novel until they've read it. Because they don't actually know how we work the magic that it takes to create the effect that they are so moved by. And yet, they are now your bosses. So my advice is to write what you like, keep writing, keep loving the process, because you don't fail until you stop. Now, what if you don't enjoy writing? What if you only enjoy having written? I have actually been through phases of that myself. Sometimes that feeling has stemmed from a specific project, but sometimes that's just kind of how I felt about writing in general. And that is definitely a topic for another video. So that's it from me for today. I'm J. Allen Riker, reminding you to write, read, and live.